One word. That was all it took. He said dead. I heard opportunity. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult me directly. He just leaned back in his chair, glanced at the spreadsheet on the screen, and used the word the way people do when they think the conversation is already over. Dead weight. Not a person. Not a role. A cost. Everyone else in the room nodded. Not because they agreed, but because nodding was easier than questioning the conclusion that had already been decided. I didn't nod. I didn't correct him either. I had learned. By then, that correction only works when the other side is still listening. They weren't in that room. Value wasn't measured by numbers. It was measured by comfort. Who made the room feel calm? Who didn't disrupt the rhythm? Who knew when to stop asking questions that required answers no one wanted to give? Data had nothing to do with it. They said they were making a rational decision, but what they really meant was that they were making a familiar one. And familiarity has a way of disguising itself as intelligence. They told themselves they were being efficient, that they were trimming what no longer mattered, that the system would work just fine without certain parts. I listened. I noticed what they didn't say. I noticed which line items were skipped over quickly, which dependencies were mentioned only in passing, which temporary solutions had quietly become permanent. They didn't ask me for my analysis. They assumed they already knew what I would say. When someone said dead, it wasn't about performance. It was about permission. Permission to stop looking closer. Permission to stop asking what would break if something disappeared. They thought I was attached. Emotional. Too close to the details. They mistook attention for attachment. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue for my relevance. I didn't remind them of past results. Because in rooms like that, defense sounds like weakness, even when it's accurate. Instead, I watched the way the conversation moved on, how quickly certainty returned once the word had been spoken, how relieved they looked to be done with it. Dead. The meeting ended shortly after. People stood up. Chairs scraped against the floor. Decisions were considered finalized. I gathered my notes slowly, not because I was stunned, but because I was recalculating. What they saw as excess, I saw as leverage. What they dismissed as replaceable, I recognized as the one thing they couldn't operate without, not because it was glamorous, but because it was invisible. Systems don't collapse where everyone is looking. They collapse where no one bothers to check. They thought the conversation was about cutting loss. It wasn't. It was about ownership. Not of a title, not of a seat at the table. Ownership of the part they had never bothered to map out completely. While they were congratulating themselves on a clean decision, I was already thinking several steps ahead. Not emotionally, strategically. Because words don't just describe reality, they shape what people stop protecting. And once something is no longer protected, it becomes available. I didn't leave angry. I didn't leave loud. I left listening. And I took the word with me. Dead. Careful what you call people. Some of them listen. Silence is often mistaken for agreement, especially in rooms where decisions are announced, not discussed. After that meeting, nothing changed on the surface. No emergency emails. No sudden revisions. No one pulled me aside to clarify what had been said. That's how I knew the word had done its job. Dead. Once a label like that is applied, people stop asking follow-up questions. They stop checking assumptions. They move on, relieved to have a conclusion that requires no further effort. I didn't correct the record. I didn't circulate data. I didn't try to reopen the discussion, because reopening it would have meant admitting it was still alive. And they were very invested in believing it wasn't. Instead, I stayed where I was. I listened to the conversations that followed in the days after. Not the official ones, the casual ones. The comments made in hallways. The shorthand explanations given to people who hadn't been in the room. The way the story simplified itself every time it was retold. It was always the same version. Non-essential. Outdated. Too expensive for what it delivers. No one mentioned dependencies. No one mentioned what relied on it quietly, consistently, without recognition. That kind of work doesn't announce itself. It just keeps things from failing. People only notice it when it's gone. And by then, it's too late to renegotiate terms. They assumed I would react the way people usually do, with urgency, with explanation, with the need to be understood. They didn't account for patience. Patience looks passive to people who confuse speed with intelligence. I continued doing my work, the same way, at the same pace, not because I was clinging to relevance, but because consistency creates cover. No one watches what feels predictable. They were already reallocating attention elsewhere. New priorities, new initiatives, new fires to put out. That's the thing about systems built on confidence rather than comprehension. They rely heavily on the assumption that yesterday's understanding will still hold tomorrow. I knew exactly how fragile that assumption was. Not from theory, from pattern. I had seen how often decisions were made without tracing consequences all the way through, how often cost-cutting was treated as strategy, how often the quiet parts of the operation were considered expendable simply because they didn't demand attention. They thought silence meant compliance. What it really meant was space. Space to observe without being noticed. Space to map what others took for granted. Space to see how many critical functions were supported by something everyone had already agreed was finished. When you remove urgency, people reveal their blind spots. They start saying things they shouldn't. They start assuming stability that doesn't exist. I listened carefully, not to confirm my position, but to understand theirs. Who depended on what? Who signed off without reading closely? Who believed redundancy existed simply because it sounded reassuring? No one checked the foundation. They trusted the label, dead, and because of that, it stopped being guarded. No contingency planning, no contractual review, no attention paid to who technically controlled it or how easily that control could change hands. I didn't rush. Rushing would have made noise. Instead, I waited for the system to relax. Systems always do, once they think a threat has been removed. By the time anyone realized there was more at stake than they'd accounted for, the conversation had already moved on. And that's when leverage begins to form, not in confrontation, not in argument, but in the quiet interval between certainty and consequence. They thought the matter was settled. It was just not in the way they expected. When something is declared finished, people stop guarding it. Not immediately. Gradually, they stop checking access. They stop reviewing assumptions. They stop asking who still depends on it and why. The word creates a kind of permission to look elsewhere, to focus forward, to assume the past can no longer reach them. That's when systems become vulnerable. I began to notice how casually it was referenced, as if it were already gone, even though it was still quietly holding things together. People talked about it in the past tense. Plans were drafted that assumed it would no longer be there. Alternatives were mentioned but never tested. No one wanted to slow things down by verifying. Verification feels unnecessary when confidence is high. What they missed wasn't a single flaw, it was a pattern. Every critical function had a fallback on paper. Every dependency had a workaround listed somewhere. But none of those workarounds had been stress-tested together. They existed in isolation, separate documents, separate teams, separate assumptions. Individually, everything looked covered. Collectively, it was fragile. That's the danger of distributed responsibility. Everyone owns a piece, so no one owns the outcome. I didn't point this out. Pointing it out would have required convincing people to care again, and caring would have forced them to reconsider the label. They were invested in that word now. Dead. I watched as access controls loosened, as review cycles shortened, as oversight quietly shifted elsewhere. No one audits what they believe is irrelevant. It wasn't negligence. It was efficiency. Efficiency always comes at the expense of redundancy, and redundancy is what keeps leverage out of the wrong hands. I started tracing connections, not officially, quietly. Which teams still relied on it indirectly? Which contracts referenced it as a temporary dependency? Which external partners had built their operations around assumptions no one had revisited in years? The answers were never in one place. They never are. You find them in overlaps, in contradictions, in the gap between what people say and what actually happens when something breaks. I realized something then. The reason it was considered replaceable wasn't because it lacked value. It was because its value wasn't visible in quarterly reports. It didn't generate attention. It prevented problems. And prevention doesn't show up as success. It just shows up as silence. They thought they were eliminating risk. What they were really doing was concentrating it. When fewer people are paying attention, fewer people notice when control shifts. No one asked who technically held authority over the underlying structure. No one reviewed the clauses that govern change of ownership. No one imagined that anyone would bother. Why would they? They had already decided it didn't matter. I kept my distance. Not physically, but conversationally. I let others explain things for me. I let assumptions circulate unchallenged. I let the narrative settle into something comfortable and incomplete. Because once a story becomes comfortable, people defend it, even when it stops being accurate. They thought the danger had passed. They thought the decision had closed the chapter. They didn't realize the chapter had simply moved somewhere quieter. Leverage doesn't announce itself. It accumulates, slowly, patiently, out of sight. And the more convinced people are that nothing important is happening, the easier it becomes to reshape what they stopped watching. By the time anyone would think to look again, the structure would already feel different, not broken, just no longer familiar. And unfamiliar systems make people nervous, especially when they realize they no longer control them. That realization wasn't theirs yet, but it was getting closer. Most turning points don't look dramatic when they happen. They look administrative. A document reviewed, a clause acknowledged, a signature placed without ceremony, no announcement, no reaction. That's how decisions slip past the people who assume power always makes noise. By the time I moved, nothing felt urgent. And urgency is the only thing that attracts supervision. Everything around it had already been deprioritized. Calendars were full elsewhere. Attention had shifted. That's when systems are easiest to touch. I didn't need permission. I needed alignment. The language already existed. The structure had been built long before I arrived. All it required was someone willing to read what others skimmed. They had treated it like legacy material, something outdated, something safe to ignore. I treated it like leverage. There were steps, of course, but none of them felt like confrontation. No one pushed back. No one asked why. No one paused long enough to notice the pattern forming, because nothing was happening yet. People are trained to respond to outcomes, not process. And process is where control changes hands. I made sure everything looked routine, because routine is invisible. Every action fit within an existing framework. Every decision aligned with policies that had been approved years ago. There was nothing to escalate, nothing to flag. If anyone had bothered to connect the dots, they might have noticed the shape changing. But connecting dots requires interest. And interest had already been withdrawn. I moved slowly on purpose. Speed creates questions. Patience creates certainty. The system accepted the changes the way it accepts all quiet adjustments, by assuming someone else had already vetted them. That's the comfort of hierarchy. Everyone trusts that someone higher up is paying attention. They weren't. By the time the last piece settled into place, nothing felt different on the surface. Meetings continued. Plans progressed. The word dead was still used casually, confidently. That word had done more work than anyone realized. It had cleared the path. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel victory. Those are emotional responses, and emotions make people careless. What I felt was alignment. Everything was where it needed to be. Not visible, not announced, just positioned. That's the thing about ownership. It doesn't require recognition to exist. It only requires documentation. And documentation doesn't care about opinions. No one had lost anything yet. That's why no one noticed. Loss creates reaction. Absence creates confusion. The absence hadn't arrived, but it was inevitable now. Because once control shifts quietly, reversing it requires consensus. And consensus is hard to build when no one agrees on when the shift occurred. Later, they would argue about timing, about intent, about whether it had been preventable. They would ask who approved it, who overlooked it, who failed to intervene. The answers would be unsatisfying because nothing had been violated, nothing had been rushed, nothing had broken the rules they themselves had written. They had simply stopped watching, and I had chosen that moment to act. Not aggressively, not defiantly, precisely. The decision didn't look like a decision at all. It looked like maintenance. By the time anyone realized the implications, the language they would reach for, mistake, oversight, error, would no longer apply. What had happened wasn't an accident. It was a consequence, and consequences don't ask permission. They arrive when the structure is ready. The first sign wasn't a failure. It was a delay, a minor one, easily explained, the kind people dismiss without documentation. Someone mentioned it in passing during a meeting. Not as a concern, just an observation. That's odd. Odd is a word people use when they don't want to interrupt momentum. No one stopped the conversation. No one asked for a deeper look. Because nothing was technically broken, the systems were still running. The outputs were still appearing. The reports still looked acceptable, if you didn't compare them too closely. That's how misalignment announces itself. Not loudly, but inconsistently. A handoff took longer than expected. A workaround was used twice instead of once. An exception became routine. Small things. The kind of things that don't justify escalation on their own. People adjusted. They always do. They blamed schedules. They blamed staffing. They blamed each other. Quietly. No one revisited the original assumption. The assumption that everything essential was still under control. I noticed how often the word temporary came up. Temporary delays. Temporary inefficiencies. Temporary strain. Temporary is a comforting word. It implies intention. But intention doesn't fix structural gaps. I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't see the pattern, but because naming it too early would have forced attention back to the wrong place. Once people start looking for causes, they look for familiar ones. Personnel, process, budget. They don't look at ownership. Not until much later. The discomfort spread slowly. People started double-checking numbers that had never needed verification before. Meetings ran a few minutes longer. Follow-up emails became more detailed. Not alarmed. Just cautious. Caution is the body's way of responding before the mind catches up. They could feel something shifting, even if they couldn't articulate what the system was compensating. It always tries to protect itself first. Redundancies were stretched. Backups were leaned on harder. Teams filled gaps without realizing they were doing it. That's how invisible labor grows. And invisible labor always reaches a breaking point. Still, no one said the word risk. Risk implies responsibility, and responsibility invites accountability. It was easier to assume the situation would resolve on its own. I watched how people spoke around the issue. Carefully, indirectly, no one wanted to be the first to suggest that the earlier decision might have been incomplete. That would have meant reopening the conversation. And reopening it would have meant acknowledging uncertainty. Certainty is precious in organizations built on confidence, even when it's misplaced. The irony wasn't lost on me. The thing they had called dead was now being quietly compensated for by people, by time, by attention. They were paying for it without realizing what they were paying for. The cost wasn't visible yet, not in a way that demanded response, but it was accumulating. Each workaround borrowed from tomorrow. Each delay shifted pressure elsewhere. The system was still functioning, but it wasn't stable. Stability feels effortless. This felt managed. That difference matters. I didn't intervene. Intervention would have slowed the process, and the process needed to continue just a little longer, long enough for the discomfort to spread, long enough for the inconsistencies to become patterns. Long enough for the question to form in someone else's mind. Not what's wrong, but who controls this now. That question hadn't been asked yet, but it was coming. And when it did, the answer would be unfamiliar. The moment always comes later than it should. Not when the first delay appears, not when the second workaround becomes routine, but when someone important is inconvenienced. That's when curiosity turns into concern. It started with a request for clarification. Not an accusation, just a question framed as due diligence. Can someone walk me through how this is currently handled? The room went quiet for a second longer than usual, not because no one knew, but because everyone assumed someone else did. Explanations followed, careful ones. Each answer technically correct, each answer incomplete. They described processes, they described roles, They described contingencies. What they didn't describe was ownership, because ownership had quietly slipped out of the narrative. Someone noticed the gaps, noticed that the explanations didn't line up cleanly. That responsibility seemed to shift depending on who was speaking. "That's odd," someone said again. But this time, it didn't sound casual. It sounded cautious. Follow-up meetings were scheduled. Documents were requested. Emails grew longer. Still, no one named the earlier decision. Still, no one revisited the word that had cleared the path: dead. They were trying to fix the symptoms without acknowledging the cause. That's a common mistake. It feels safer. People prefer solvable problems over uncomfortable truths. As the questions continued, the tone changed. Not openly, subtly, conversations became more defensive, explanations more precise, language more careful. People began protecting themselves instead of the system. That's when you know uncertainty has crossed a threshold. Someone finally asked it, not in the main meeting, in a smaller one, lower stakes, less visibility. Who actually controls this now? The question didn't land cleanly. There was a pause, then another explanation, then a deflection. Control was described as shared, distributed, temporary. Temporary is a useful word when no one wants to admit permanence. But systems don't operate on intention. They operate on authority, and authority had moved. Not dramatically, not illegally, procedurally. They pulled more records, reviewed older agreements, traced changes backward. The deeper they looked, the more uncomfortable it became, because there was no clear moment they could point to and say, "That's when we lost it." There was no error to correct, no rule to undo. Just a sequence of reasonable steps that led somewhere unexpected. People started using a different tone when they spoke to me, more careful, more neutral, not because they suspected me, but because they sensed imbalance. Imbalance makes people cautious around everyone. They didn't know what had changed, only that something had. That's when the conversation shifted from fixing to explaining, from "how do we resolve this" to "how did this happen?" And explanations, unlike fixes, require accountability. They began searching for a decision maker, someone who could say yes or no, someone who could reverse course. But reversing course requires authority, and authority requires consensus. Consensus requires agreement on reality. They didn't have that. Some believed nothing fundamental had changed. Others believed control had slipped. No one could prove it definitively. The documentation was clear, but only if you knew where to look. Most didn't. The discomfort turned into tension, not panic, not yet. Just the growing awareness that the system they thought they understood was no longer responding the way it used to. When systems stop responding predictably, people start asking harder questions, not about performance, about power. Who decides? Who approves? Who can stop this if it goes further? Those questions hung in the air, unanswered. And unanswered questions create pressure. Pressure doesn't explode immediately. It builds quietly, relentlessly. By the time they realized the question wasn't who should control it, but who already did, they would be looking in the wrong direction, because control doesn't wait to be acknowledged. It just operates. By the time urgency appeared, it felt out of place, like someone raising their voice in a room that had already decided to whisper. The first attempt to fix things was procedural. A review, a task force, a request for updated documentation. That's how institutions reassure themselves, by creating structure around uncertainty. But structure doesn't restore control once it's moved. They framed the problem carefully, not as loss, not as failure, as a misalignment, a word chosen to avoid blame. Misalignment suggests adjustment, realignment, correction. It doesn't suggest consequence. Meetings multiplied, calendars filled. People spoke faster, less confidently. They asked for projections, for impact assessments, for timelines, all the right questions. Just late, I noticed how often my name came up, not directly, but adjacent. Wasn't she close to this? She might have insight. Ask her to walk us through how it used to work. That tense mattered. They still believed the past held the answer, that if they understood what had been, they could restore it. That's not how control works. Control doesn't rewind. It consolidates. I explained what I could accurately. Carefully, I described processes, dependencies, constraints. I didn't describe leverage, because leverage only exists until it's acknowledged. Once it's named, it invites resistance. They were already resisting. What they didn't realize was that resistance requires access, and access was no longer unilateral. Attempts were made to assert authority, requests sent, expectations stated, assumptions implied. The responses they received were polite, correct, compliant on the surface, but slower, more conditional, less automatic. That's when frustration entered the room. Not panic, not yet, but irritation. Irritation is often the first emotional signal that power has shifted. Someone finally said it out loud. This shouldn't be this hard. They were right. It shouldn't have been, not if things were still arranged the way they believed. The harder they pushed, the clearer it became that the system was responding differently now, not refusing, just recalibrating. Boundaries that hadn't existed before were suddenly enforced. Processes that once bent now held firm. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, just enough friction to slow momentum. They started talking about escalation, who to involve, who to pressure, who could intervene. But escalation assumes there's a higher level to appeal to. That assumption only holds when authority is centralized. Here, they weren't dealing with defiance. They were dealing with structure. Structure doesn't respond to tone. It responds to rules. And the rules hadn't been broken. That was the most unsettling part. No violation, no misconduct, just an outcome no one had anticipated. They searched for the moment it went wrong. They asked for timelines, compared versions, reviewed approvals. Every step had a justification. Every change fit within an existing framework. There was no clean reversal, only negotiation. And negotiation implies parity. They weren't used to that. The realization settled slowly. Not everyone accepted it at the same time. Some still believed this was temporary, a misunderstanding, a phase. Others saw it clearly. The system no longer belonged exclusively to them, not because it had been taken, but because it had been neglected. Ownership doesn't vanish. It transfers, usually to whoever is paying attention. The room felt different now, less certain, less confident. People spoke more carefully around me. Not because they suspected intent, but because they sensed capability. That's when perception changes. I didn't correct them. Correction would have implied explanation. Explanation would have implied apology. This wasn't something to apologize for. They had asked for efficiency. They had asked for resolution. They had named something dead. What followed wasn't rebellion. It was consequence. And consequences don't negotiate on your timeline. The change didn't happen all at once. It rarely does. It showed up in tone first. Emails that used to assume compliance began to include qualifiers. Can you confirm? Would it be possible? We'd appreciate if small shifts, easy to miss if you weren't listening for them. Authority doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes word by word. Meetings followed the same pattern. What had once been directives were now framed as discussions. What had once been deadlines were now described as targets. No one acknowledged the shift openly. They pretended nothing fundamental had changed. But pretense takes effort, and effort leaves traces. They stopped speaking in absolutes, stopped assuming outcomes, stopped ending sentences with certainty. Instead, they paused, checked reactions, waited for confirmation before moving forward. Waiting is a form of admission. It says, we no longer move unilaterally. Someone finally named the reality. Carefully. We need to coordinate more closely. Coordinate, not control, not direct. Coordinate implies shared power. That word lingered in the room longer than it should have. No one challenged it. They couldn't, because challenging it would have required proving the old authority still existed, and proof was in short supply. They asked for alignment sessions, for joint reviews, for updated frameworks, all reasonable requests, all late. I agreed to what made sense, declined what didn't, not emotionally, structurally. I referenced constraints, Dependencies, existing commitments. Nothing invented, nothing exaggerated. The system responded exactly as designed. That's what unsettled them most. There was no villain, no sabotage, no dramatic takeover, just a set of rules operating without regard for who used to benefit from them. They tried to speed things up. Speed is a common response to lost control, but speed without authority only increases friction. The more they pushed, the clearer the boundaries became. Not hostile, just firm. That firmness forced a reckoning. They had to decide whether to continue pretending or adapt. Adaptation began quietly. They started looping me in earlier, asking for input instead of approval, checking assumptions before finalizing decisions. The hierarchy flattened, not officially, but functionally. That's the kind of change that never shows up on org charts. But everyone feels it. Some resisted. They spoke nostalgically about how things used to work, about clarity, about decisiveness. They framed the past as stability. What they meant was dominance. Others adjusted quickly. They recognized that the fastest way forward wasn't to reclaim authority, but to negotiate within the new structure. Negotiation is slower, messier, less satisfying to people accustomed to command, but it's the only option when leverage is distributed. They began asking a different kind of question. Not why is this happening, but what do we need to do to move forward? That question assumes dependence. Dependence shifts tone. It turns demands into conversations, deadlines into discussions, certainty into contingency. I could feel the balance settling. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but definitively. They hadn't lost everything, but they no longer held everything either. That distinction matters, because once people accept that power is shared, they stop trying to take it back outright. They start trying to influence. Influence requires persuasion, and persuasion requires listening. Listening is slow, but it's also honest. They were listening now, not because they wanted to, because they had to. The system had made its choice, not loudly, not publicly, but in a way that couldn't be undone without cost. And cost is something institutions avoid whenever possible. They would adapt. They always do, but adaptation comes with memory. They would remember how this felt, the uncertainty, the recalibration. They wouldn't use the word dead so easily again, not after learning what happens when people take words seriously. The most telling sign wasn't resistance. It was routine. Things began to settle, not back to how they were, but into something quieter, something adjusted. People stopped framing every interaction as temporary, stopped referring to the situation as a phase. Language stabilized. Requests came in with clearer expectations. Meetings had agendas that assumed shared input. Decisions were no longer announced. They were shaped. No one made a statement about it. No memo, no acknowledgement. Because acknowledging it would have required admitting that the old certainty was gone. Instead, everyone adapted in small, practical ways. They updated workflows, revised timelines, built in approvals where none had existed before, not as a concession, as a precaution. Precautions become habits quickly. The system learned where it could move freely and where it couldn't. That learning didn't come from policy. It came from experience, from deadlines that slipped unless coordination happened, from initiatives that stalled without early alignment, from assumptions that no longer held. People adjusted their expectations of speed, of authority, of outcome. They didn't like it. But dislike doesn't reverse reality. The conversations changed tone again, less guarded now, less tense. Not because trust had fully returned, but because predictability had. Predictability is a form of comfort. They knew what to expect from the system now, even if it wasn't what they had before. They learned which levers still worked, which ones didn't. They learned that pressure produced diminishing returns. That collaboration moved things forward faster than insistence. They learned, quietly, that the center of gravity had shifted. No one said it out loud. They spoke around it instead. This requires coordination. We'll need alignment here. Let's make sure everyone's on the same page. Those phrases replaced certainty. Certainty is a luxury of uncontested power. Some people left, not dramatically, not in protest. They drifted toward roles where authority still felt clear. Where decisions were simpler, others stayed and adjusted. They learned how to operate within the new constraints, how to influence without command, how to negotiate outcomes instead of dictating them. The system absorbed the change the way it absorbs all structural shifts, by normalizing them. Soon, new hires didn't know it had ever been different. They accepted the current state as the baseline. That's how power becomes invisible again, not because it disappears, but because it becomes expected. I noticed fewer sideways glances, fewer careful pauses when I spoke, not because suspicion had vanished, but because familiarity had replaced it. They knew where the lines were now. And people are surprisingly comfortable once lines are clear, even if they didn't draw them. The irony wasn't lost on me. The thing they had labeled dead had become foundational again, not through revival, but through ownership. It didn't need to be praised. It didn't need to be defended. It simply existed as a fact. And facts don't argue. The earlier discomfort faded into memory. The urgency dulled. What remained was a system that moved differently, slower in some places, more deliberate in others. But stability returned, just not to the same hands. No one apologized. No one admitted fault. They didn't need to. The outcome spoke for itself. They had learned something, not about me, not about control, about attention, about what happens when decisions are made casually and words are used carelessly. They wouldn't say dead again, not because the word was offensive, but because they understood its cost. The system had adjusted. An adjustment, once complete, doesn't ask to be undone. It simply continues, as if this had always been the way things worked. There was no moment of recognition, no apology, no acknowledgement, no sentence that closed the loop neatly. That's not how these things end. They end the way they began, quietly. The meetings kept happening. The emails kept coming, just different. People were more careful with language now, not because anyone told them to be, but because experience had taught them restraint. Words were chosen slowly, descriptions softened, certainty became conditional, not out of politeness. Out of memory, they had learned that words don't disappear once spoken. They settle. They change behavior. They alter what people stop protecting. No one mentioned the meeting where it started. No one referenced the moment the word was used. It wasn't necessary. Everyone carried it in their own way. Some became more cautious, others more curious. A few became quieter, not because they were afraid, but because they understood the value of listening. Listening reveals where power actually sits. I noticed how often silence appeared in conversations now. Not awkward silence, considered silence. The kind that suggests someone is measuring impact before speaking. That kind of silence used to be rare. It isn't anymore. The system continued to operate. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but honestly, it acknowledged constraints instead of ignoring them. It accounted for dependencies instead of assuming them away. Nothing heroic happened. No one won. There was no celebration. Ownership doesn't require applause. It requires continuity. Things held because someone was paying attention, because the structure was respected, because assumptions were tested before being repeated. People adapted. They always do. Adaptation doesn't mean agreement. It means survival. And survival often looks like acceptance. They accepted that control is fragile, that certainty is temporary, that the things they ignore are often the ones holding everything together. I didn't need to remind them. They reminded themselves every time they paused before speaking, every time they chose a different word. The system had learned its lesson, not through instruction, through consequence. Words shape behavior. Behavior shapes structure. Structure decides who owns what. Long after the conversation ends, I still think about that word sometimes. Dead. Not because it was cruel, but because it was careless. Carelessness creates openings, not for revenge, for rearrangement. I didn't correct the language when I heard it again later. Used more cautiously, with a smile meant to signal self-awareness. Correction wasn't necessary. Understanding had already settled in. That's the thing about listening. When people realize someone has been listening all along, they become careful. Not because they fear retaliation, but because they respect consequence. There's no lesson here, no moral, just a pattern. Words are choices. Choices create outcomes, and some outcomes don't announce themselves. They simply remain quiet, unaltered, owned,